Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a wolf in graphite. Now this tutorial is really going to focus on how to draw fur with graphite, but before I get into that I'm going to start off with the eye. Now this will be my approach for working on any subject. I like to make sure that I've got the eye right before I look at anything else. This is where the emotion and expression stems from, so I do just want to make sure that I've got that accurate. Now you can see here that this wolf does have a background to it, and I always draw my backgrounds first. So if I work with graphite and I'm just drawing a subject on the white paper, then the eye is going to be the first thing I start with. However, if I am including a background, then I will always draw that first. The reason being is when I come to overlap the fur on the edges of the face and the body, I want that to appear like it's in front, so it pushes that background back. If you add the fur in first and then draw your background, you have a tendency to have to then draw around those sections of fur. So that there just takes far longer, and I think you can end up with a bit of a flatter feel because it makes the background and the fur look on the same level, whereas we must have that fur looking like it's sat on top. So that there is the exception. I will do the background first and then work on the animal. So when it comes to working on the fur, the layers here are really important. Now I've got lots of tutorials here on YouTube that show different types of fur depending on the texture, because the way that we layer and use our pencils will vary. But for this, there was a mixture of light and dark hairs. I didn't really look at this reference photo and think, right, okay, that light hair is on top because it's a highlight. It was more like the salt and pepper look where you've got some mixture of grey hairs in between your lights and your darks. So this did definitely make it for one of those processes where we have to think a little bit more carefully about how we layer those graphite pencils. Now, of course, this is something that's far more easier to follow and explain in the real-time version on Patreon. Because there are no parts there that are sped up or cut out, I'm really able to explain each process as I go. But here you can see that I'm putting down some graphite. I'm reinforcing my contrast with every layer that I add. So I'm starting to add some darker tones in here. And then I will also soften that out and lift up some graphite with my erasers. Now I did find with this fur texture and this sort of markings that worked really well. I'm not strictly working from light to dark, and I'm not working from dark to light either. So this here is definitely one of those situations where we need to study that reference photo closely and really make sure that we're working on the right layer at the right time. Now a question that I am often asked is how to avoid graphite shine when working with your graphite pencils. Now unfortunately it's just part of the medium. You are going to get some degree of shine. You can reduce how much of that will be in your portrait with how you layer those pencils. So for instance, if you have a really dark section of fur or maybe around the eye, you don't just want to jump into your darkest, softest pencil, something like your 9B first, because you are more likely to get that shine. You want to build up those layers slowly. However, you'll often see here that with my drawing board, I will tilt that forward, I'll go back again, and that's just helping me to judge what that looks like when I don't have my bright overhead lights on my easel, which will make that shine more exaggerated. So I will all throughout this drawing process keep tilting that forwards so that I can get a bit more of a truer idea of how that would look once it's framed on someone's wall. And I find that really useful. Because when you're looking at it in more of a standard lighting that's not with our overhead lights, which are very close to our drawing, you'll probably then notice that your darks will go darker and you'll have a lot more depth within the fur. So that's one thing that I would always recommend to check throughout your drawing process. However, what is really important is throughout the drawing process, if you ever feel like you don't have your contrast right, and what I mean by that is your darks aren't dark enough or your highlights aren't bright enough, then it's really worthwhile to make sure that you then carry on layering to reinforce those shadows and highlights, because that there is the most important thing, especially with graphite, any medium. I talk about it in all of my tutorials, but with graphite, because we don't have colour, we have to make sure that the values are correct and nice and sharp. Now in a moment, as I start to build up my darker tones, I realised that I actually wanted my background to be darker. So here, as I'm using my eraser to lift up that graphite to really expose those lighter highlights on the edge, I felt like I could make that fur look brighter by darkening my background. Now this will work with any subject, so if you're working on fur and you've allowed the white of the paper to show through, but you still feel like that's not bright enough, the main cause of that will be that whatever's next to it isn't dark enough. Now if you look here as I start to darken up this background, it will make the edge and the top section of that ear appear brighter. You can see I'm not touching that ear at all anymore, but it's because I'm darkening up what's next to it. Now when I work with backgrounds, I don't actually call them finished until the very last section of that drawing, because backgrounds don't really make a whole lot of sense until you've got the in focus subject drawn in. So here I actually did work on this background 2 or 3 times throughout the drawing process, always with the view of adjusting my contrasts. If I felt that the trees in the background here needed to be a little bit darker, I would go ahead and do that. And there were many times where I wanted to remove some of that graphite to have a little bit more of a misty fog effect between that woodland forest. Now the one thing here that you can see, just like with all of my other tutorials here on YouTube, is I am working in small manageable chunks. Now this has always been my preference. I don't really like working in whole individual layers and building up my whole base layer for my subject and then future layers on top. I personally find that I start to rush things if I do that. Now if you do feel yourself getting a little bit overwhelmed and stressed by whatever it is you're drawing, usually it's because we're working on too much of a larger area. If we only focus on 1 or 2 square inches, just like what I am here with this one tiny section of fur, that there prevents me from becoming like stressed and focusing on everything else around it. By only working on one small area, before we even realise it, this animal that we're drawing is already looking more like that reference photo. Whereas if I'd have spent an hour, 2 hours on the base layer for the entire wolf, that there's taken me longer, but I still don't, it's not a pretty stage. So the fact that I've been able to work in small chunks and build up my layers gradually as I am here, I could easily leave this on today's drawing session as it is now, and then it already looks like that photograph. I'm far more likely to be more motivated and want to pick up my pencils the following day and get straight back to it. Now that I've got more of the fur drawn in, you can really see how the pencil technique plays such an important role in building up the 3-dimensional shape of the face. Now of course this does also go back to contrast, which I've spoken about a lot already. The highlights and shadows and where they're positioned are not random, so we really do want to be studying that photograph to make sure that we get those in the right places. For instance, the little highlights above the eyes, that there is indicating at the top of the eye socket. The darker section in between the eyes in the middle of the forehead, that's showing the person who's looking at this drawing that that's where the skull slightly dips in on that centre section. So the highlights, shadows there, for those reasons, are so important. But the pencil technique, there are 3 things that I want to focus on: the fur length, fur thickness, and fur direction. Now this here, when we're working with graphite, is also going to be the same when working with erasers when you're lifting off the graphite. So regardless of that, we want to be making sure that that fur direction is precise to that photo. So here you can see where that fur comes over the top of the eye, it curves over towards the right hand side of the page, and on the left eye it does the opposite, it curves up and over towards the left edge of that paper. If we don't get that angle right with the fur direction, we're going to end up making the face look really wide or too narrow. So here, that's one thing that we want to be focusing on right from those very first layers. So throughout this tutorial, I have spoken about the importance of pencil technique and how to change that for the different fur textures that we might be drawing. Now I do have a Patreon library on my website, which I will link in the description below, and that has a complete list of all tutorials that are available on my Patreon channel, so you get an idea of what's there before you sign up. Now the wonderful thing with Patreon is how flexible it is, so you can stay for as long as you want or you can cancel at any time, and as soon as you do join the tier that you are working in, I've got pastels, acrylics or graphite, you get complete access to all tutorials within that tier as soon as you join. So if you've got any questions about Patreon or any art related questions that I can help with, pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. Now when it comes to working on noses, this is going to vary depending on the nose that you're drawing, because obviously each animal is going to have a slightly different structure, but the main concept is the same. You want the nostrils in the right place, and if there is that centre line between the 2 nostrils, I like to map that in because that's going to help to build up the shape of the nose. But my main focus here is to build up the 3-dimensional shape with how it curves over. Now this here is where you can see that scrap bit of paper, and I was showing my Patreon members exactly how I'm using that pencil in a really slowed down step-by-step version. The way that you are positioning your highlights and shadows here is going to help with the curve of that nose. So not only do I want to indicate it where the nostrils curve over from the inner edge to the outer surface of the nose, but I also want to show where it then slopes at the top to meet the bridge of the nose. And that is all in the position of our highlights and shadows, just like what I've mentioned earlier when drawing fur. So the shadows, your darks and your brights, they are so important. Now once I've finished on the nose, that's when I'll start to map in the fur on the bridge of the nose. Now, when I was very first new to doing pet portraits, this is the one area where I found I usually get stuck with the fur direction. I'd either make my pencil strokes far too straight and they'd go straight up on a vertical line, or I'd overcompensate and I'd make them too flat and they'd be really horizontal. We always have to make sure that there is a degree of curvature to each of our pencil strokes. So everything in nature, there's nothing that's straight. You know, grass, trees, for instance, they are never completely straight. They might look upright, but there's still going to be a curve. And this is definitely the case when drawing fur. And now that I've zoomed out here, you can really see how the top section of the bridge of the nose, it does look like it's curved over towards the cheeks. That there is all based on the fur direction and how that I've managed to move my pencil to build up the shape of the face. Now the one layer that I haven't spoken about yet is my base layer. Now regardless of the medium that I work in, I put a lot of focus on this very first stage. You can see that although there are no details at all, I am hinting at my lights and my darks. I don't put a set colour down or a set tonal value. I make sure that I'm hinting at the structure of that body, that face, whatever it is that I'm drawing, as closely as I can right from that very first layer. Now the one thing that I would recommend here is if I'm working on something where the fur is particularly bright, maybe there's a really light highlight, then that's there where you might want to leave the white of the paper visible. You don't necessarily want to put graphite down, and for my base layer I'm using graphite powder for this. But if you want to keep the highlight nice and bright and as crisp as you possibly can, for instance like the highlights in the eye of this wolf, they're the brightest part of this portrait. That there is because I've allowed the paper to show through. However good your erasers are, you're never truly going to be able to lift off all of that graphite, so it is something just to bear in mind. Now when it comes to working on the fur here, everything that I've put in practice on the face also is incorporated with this fur. The only real difference here is look how much longer the fur is compared to the face. So this is where I need to lengthen the pencil strokes and then adjust that pencil technique. Now this is something that I have mentioned a lot here, and if it is one of those areas where you feel you get a little bit stuck, then this real-time tutorial on Patreon is going to be useful. I do focus on this from start to finish. And as I then start to work on this last section on the right hand side, I want to make sure now that the fur texture looks very different because this was out of focus. This part that I'm working on is actually more of the back, the side of the wolf, the hip area where the rear leg would be. So this here does need to be out of focus because it's all the way at the back end of that wolf. So in order to achieve that, I've had to use softening and blending techniques, and I've had to alter my pencil technique as well. Now at this stage, all I'm doing here is refining my contrast. I'll darken up some shadows and brighten my highlights, and then I'll add my whiskers. I like to leave the whiskers to the very last layer because they are overlapping everything else. If you draw them in too soon and then realise you haven't finished the fur underneath, it can be really tricky because you then have to draw around each of those whiskers. And here is a photograph of my finished portrait. I do hope that the tips and techniques I've shared in this video are useful. If they are, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. And as I've mentioned, the reference photo line art and material list are available with the real-time version of this tutorial on Patreon, and that is all linked in the description below. I also upload 2 to 3 videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'm going to be uploading another video here to YouTube in the next few days.